Scuta, portate! Scuta, toglite! Scuta, toglite! Yowie, ottimo, massimo! Muove!
So here we are for the 4th Patreon documentary. I'd like to take a moment now to thank all of you patrons, because you are making these projects possible. Thank you for your constant and generous support. The Roman army was considered the most advanced of its time. We can say that, in a way, it was the Roman army that created the Roman Empire. And not only Rome itself, but a big part of Western Europe actually benefited from the riches that the Roman army would bring back from conquered territories. Ancient Rome, at its height, stretched from the British Isles to the Near East, dominating through conquest and assimilation. Much of this power was due to its formidable military, the legions, the legiones. But here is the leading question of this video. What made the Roman legionaries so effective in battle? Well, we have all heard that the Roman army was a powerful force due to their strong discipline and extensive organization skills, especially against less organized enemies. That is a fact, but it's not all there is to it. There are a lot of separate reasons, factors that play an important role in the reason why the Roman legions were so effective in battle. One thing is for sure, there isn't one single answer that we can use, such as the equipment or the tactics or the generals or the money. All of these things and others will play an important role, and once you put them all together, you will then understand why the Roman legions were so effective in battle. As a matter of fact, I truly believe that all of these points gain their strength once you connect them. More on that later. constant training was definitely an important characteristic of the Roman legions. Soldiers in the Roman army were constantly subject to a ferocious and rigorous regime, which turned them into an army of professionals. Not only that increased their individual strength, speed, precision and effectiveness as single combatants, but they also constantly drilled formation combat. They utilized muscle memory training. They became war machines, able to perfectly understand and execute their officers' commands in the midst of battle. So we understand that the Romans trained constantly and that training played a very important role in the effectiveness of the legions. But how did they train? Well, here's how this situation can become interesting. We do have some information when we read Roman writers, and of course one of the most famous ones is Vegetius, Publius Cornelius Vegetius. But of course we have to be careful because he's not referring to his own times. He's referring to times long gone and possibly towards the end of Republican times. So what we read and what we learn from Vegetius needs to be taken with a pinch of salt. For example, the fact that he mentions the idea of Roman soldiers training with wooden counterparts to their weapons and shields, so basically the gladius and the scutum. We don't know how widespread that practice would be, and we are not really sure as whether it really did make the legionaries faster and stronger at using normal weapons. It might have, in fact, a little bit of a placebo effect. The question could be then why did they do it if it didn't work? Well, they surely didn't have access to the sort of scientific understanding we have access to now. In fact, if you're interested into this topic, you might want to, I'd like to refer you to Matt Easton's from Schola Gladiatoris channel. He made a video on this, and I think he made some really good points, and he does link some interesting articles in the description that actually favor the idea of training with either weapons of the same weight as the ones that you would actually use in combat, or even lighter weapons. This of course doesn't mean that the Romans didn't do it. It is possible that they still did, but on the other hand, we don't know how widespread of a practice that was. We shouldn't imagine all Roman legions in the entirety of the history of Rome using this specific technique of training. But another question that we might want to ask is, how did they actually train? What did they do? How did they drill? Some of the information, again, is interesting. We have it. But on the other hand, I believe that experiential archaeology, experimental archaeology are very important. So what reenactment group can do is extremely important to support academic studies. Now, I myself have decided to devolve a little bit of Patreon funds to recreate a Roman contubernium. A contubernium meaning 8 soldiers led by Adeganus. And we are almost getting there. In fact, some of the clips that you have seen at the beginning of this video, the intro of this video, they were not there just to be climatic, but they were there also to show you what we are doing. We're trying to recreate Roman commands and shouts in Latin. We've been studying statuary evidence to try and understand the combat stance, and then we have been practicing the usage of gladius and scutum constantly. And that is something towards, it's a project that I'm working on, could be considered a continuation of this documentary, which will help us understand, with time hopefully, and of course your help, how the Romans fought. I'd like to also take a moment to mention the Legio 14th Gemina. It's a Northern American historical reenactment group of which I am part of. If you are in America, for example, and you'd like to join them, that you can do, and I will leave a link in the description to their page. I am officially a member of the Legio. They are a fantastic group. They do everything in a very historically accurate way, and I might participate to one of their events in America soon. Now, in the part about training, you must have noticed that my friend Luca and I, we were both training for thrusts with the gladius, but also for slashes, and I'm sure that some people will immediately bring up the point, as it often happens in the comments below of my YouTube channel, bringing up the concept of, well, weren't the Romans only taught to thrust? Why are you practicing slashing? And the evidence that they bring against this is the idea of, if you are in tight formation and you're trying to slash, you might hit the guy next to you. Well, first off, as far as we understand, yes, there were some situations when Roman formation was really shoulder to shoulder, such as, for example, testudo, but we also know that there were more open formations. In fact, a lot of reenactment groups, they actually prefer using this sort of formation, having basically the space of a man between 2 soldiers, in which case you could actually move your arm for an actual slash. It's true also that Vegetius does mention thrusting as the most effective and quickest way to kill an opponent, particularly when you thrust them and stab them in their stomach, but that again doesn't mean that they did not slash. And my personal interpretation to this is that yes, Yes, Roman legionaries preferred thrusting, but they would also slash if the occasion presented itself. In fact, when we read the accounts of the Dacian Wars, we read about opponents of the Roman army being dismembered. And I'm sorry, but you can't dismember an opponent thrusting. You have to slash, you have to chop in order to cut limbs. When we talk about the importance of discipline, we need to understand one thing. The discipline of the Romans meant that any break of the formation would be frequently rallied and regrouped to continue the fight. So we could say that there were three main areas of actual military training that allowed the Romans to be very effective on the battlefield. They were well organized, well disciplined, and well trained. Apparently, as far as we understand, discipline was very consistent across all legions, so there was not a significant variance in quality from one unit to the next. Of course, the first cohorts of some legions were double strength, increasing the number of soldiers, but in terms of discipline, training and organization, we could say that the Roman legions were even throughout the empire. Okay, so we understand that Roman legionaries were highly disciplined. Also, we need to keep in mind that the rules they were expected to follow were rigorous, and most importantly, punishment for infractions was very harsh. Now, there were quite a lot of possible ways a Roman soldier could be punished for infractions, but of course, I think the most famous one would be decimation, meaning that 1 out of every 10 soldiers would be killed because of the infractions made by the unit or perhaps the actual contubernium. But an important thing to say is that we shouldn't imagine decimation to be something that common. It happened, but it didn't happen for the entirety of Roman history. There were chunks of Roman history where decimation was abolished. But regardless of whether it was to death or not, punishments for infringements were very strict and harsh, and that was a key component to create the high discipline of the legionaries. As a matter of fact, we should imagine that Roman legionaries had to fear their commanding officers more than their enemies. But how can that be possible? Well, think about it. If you've got an enemy of Rome, okay, your actual opponent in battle, and you've got your legatus, your general, if they both want you dead, well, at least with your enemy you stand a chance of trying to defend yourself. With the legatus, you can't. If he wants you dead, you are dead. Now, another very important factor, apart from training and discipline, is the equipment. And I would like to divide this into the body armor they would have, the weapons that they would use, and also logistics, transportation, building materials, engineers, architects. All of this falls within the list of advantages that the Roman legions would have against their less organized enemies. And you can tell that I have now a book in my hand. It's called Roman Body Armor by Hilary and John Travis. It's an excellent read. They are both academics, but they are also reenactors. So I think they have a dual understanding, a sort of broader understanding of how Roman armor actually works. You can find it on Amazon. It's actually quite cheap, and I'll see if I can leave a link for you if you want to acquire this book. And I will be using this book as a basis for quite a lot of videos and content in the future. Now, one thing that we can notice as we study the development and progression and evolution of Roman armor, one thing we see immediately is that the Romans constantly tried to find ways to improve their weapons and their armors, not only by making them actually better, changing the sort of materials they were using, coming up with new designs, sometimes also by taking inspiration from their beaten enemies, for example, but also evolving their equipment depending on the demands of the sort of enemies that they were fighting against. That is why, for example, we see the development of the Roman manica, which we see already in gladiatorial games, and it was used, for example, by the Roman legions when fighting during the Dacian Wars, because of the sort of weapons that their opponents were using, because in that case the Roman soldiers needed that extra protection to the striking arm. The Romans used a huge variety of sets of armor, of kinds of armor, from lorica, squamata to hamata to segmentata, but definitely the most common and iconic type of Roman armor is mail. But regardless of the kind of armor a given soldier would choose or would be able to afford, what really set aside the Roman legion was the fact that every single soldier would have a full kit. And that is probably the marvel of the Roman legions, which is rooted in the economic success of both the Republic and the Empire. A strong and effective army is a well-equipped and well-fed army. And in order to achieve these 2 points, you need to have a very successful economic and financial machine behind it. Also, another important aspect is the military geniuses that the Roman army had, some of which, for example, the most important one, well, the most famous one would be, of course, Julius Caesar and Scipio Africanus and so on. And that shouldn't surprise us, because you have to imagine such a militaristic government in such a massive country, so having such a big pool from which you can draw, eventually you will get the geniuses, and of course they did. And if you're interested in understanding the sort of battles and war that you had between these two geniuses, Hannibal on one side and Scipio on the other, then I would refer you to a video, actually a few videos that I've made on this topic, and I will leave links in the description below. All that has been said so far leads us to this one single point: the economic structure. Well, you see, the economic structure of both the Republic and the Empire was, in a way, mortar that secured the success of the Roman armies. This created what I'd like to call a perfect economic loop. Now think about it this way: the Roman Republic was very successful from an economic point of view. This allowed it to create, as I said before, well-fed, well-equipped, and also well-paid soldiers. Now, these kind of soldiers that were trained constantly managed to win battles and gain new territories, from which we have the spoils of war, the so-called loot, more money and riches, which were then invested to create more well-fed, well-equipped and well-trained and paid soldiers, which again would gain more territories, which would bring back more spoils of war, which would ignite this ever-extending and reproducing loop, economic loop, which I believe was the secret to Roman success. So, as we said, all of these factors that we have mentioned definitely play an important role. But the fact that the Romans found this key to create a self-replicating governmental solid organism with a strong economic basis brought them success. It was an ever-growing self-replicating governmental organism which started to ingurgitate more and more land to satisfy its hunger for growth.